Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Inconvenient Questions, a weekly podcast where we ask questions about a variety of cultural, economic, and intellectual topics which are politically inconvenient, and we let you determine who they are inconvenient for. My name is Clifford, and I am joined by my friend and practicing mathematician Jeffrey. We are recording this episode on the evening of March 9th, 2025, and boy, do we have an interesting discussion for you today. With DOGE continuing to expose the waste, fraud, and abuse within the federal government, Americans are getting an opportunity to see how trillions of taxpayer dollars have been spent and to judge for themselves whether the federal government has been using those dollars wisely. It seems that in the contest between the political parties in D.C. to control government, more and more taxpayer funds are being directed towards partisan causes, and little of it is actually making its way to the Americans who are in most need of assistance and protection. So, with lots of programs on the chopping block, in this week's discussion, we will be asking the following inconvenient questions. Why have so many people come to see speech as a weapon? Does unrestricted migration help those actually in need of asylum? And who really benefits from the federal student loan programs? So let's get started. I think that when people look at the federal government today, and they look at the question of collective action problems like regulating pollution, I don't think that rises to the level of outrage that we're seeing. I think that on the one hand, like literally money going out the door from the federal government to tons and tons of improper activities, that outrages people because that's ultimately taxpayer funds. And most of the population that is outraged are taxpayers. I think that what also outrages people, especially people who conduct business, who own businesses in the United States, or have organizations, or try to do something for which regulation applies, it's not the collective action problem and that really is the focus of their outrage. I think it's actually the partisanship of it. The fact that it seems that regulations almost exist, in certain people's minds, regulations exist as a tool for political opponents to stymie the activities of others and to completely dismiss and ignore the behavior of loyalists, right? People who are aligned with the political coalition. And I think that what we're touching upon is what I see as the hyper-politicization of society through regulation. That the regulatory state has basically made it the case that literally everything that everybody does has some impact on some person's political coalition. And as a result, it seems like every office holder is effectively selecting to enforce certain laws and not others based off of not what is in the public good, like what would actually be the most efficient outcome, targeting regulation towards either the greatest offenders or the offenders for which there will be the greatest impact, right? So you could potentially target it in such a way that if it's wise, the activity that you're trying to discourage is maximally discouraged with minimum amount of effort. And if that were the discussion that people were having today, I think we'd be in a whole different environment. I mean, that would be a world of, I guess, for political scientists, the people that study this stuff in the university, this would be like utopia, because they'd be like, I've got lots of theories for you. But that's not the world we live in. The thing that people are outraged about is the fact that they see clear selective prosecution, selective enforcement, that it's entirely partisan in nature, and that it seems like everything is at stake when there's an election.
I think you've hit on something important, which is that the regulatory state is largely a precursor and a cause of hyperpartisanship. But you say that people are outraged, but some people are outraged on the other side, right? That there is that selective enforcement isn't more selective, and that the regulatory state isn't bigger, right? Now this is not maybe the zeitgeist of 2025, but there are, tens of millions of people who honestly think that post facto laws and even criminal laws are a legitimate way to make sure that the other team gets punished, that Trump gets what he deserves, right, on the Democratic side, or that illegal aliens get what they deserve on the Republican side. And this is not an insignificant part of the electorate. It's probably more people in America today believe in post facto criminal laws than believed in Bolshevism in 1917. Until we address that elephant in the room and convince everyone that the rule of law and the rule of lenity is a public good, we're going to wind up in this situation.
Did you say leniency?
The rule of leniency, the
Okay.
idea that if somebody says something or does something, you assume that they meant well, even if you know that they didn't.
And you're saying until we address the fact that this is eroding.
And yeah, until we turn people's hearts away and let them see that we can't make people happier through mass incarceration. We can't make the world better through mass random regulation. That we're all in this together, and we have to respect each other and actively try to be kind even when it's hard. And for a lot of diehard Democrats, that's sacrilege. I mean, you get called a Nazi for saying that. You get called a Nazi for standing up for free speech or for due process. And there are people who actively talk, and this isn't a joke. I mean, this is something that would have been a Saturday Night Live skit when we were kids, right? The idea of people weaponizing free speech and weaponizing due process.
Yeah, I really don't like that word. I always want to put it in air quotes if I ever use it.
But the thing is that people aren't using it ironically. They honestly believe that. They honestly believe that the problem with the world is that we're too free, that people are free to disagree with the with whatever good people think, or whatever enlightened public opinion is. And until we address that, until we convince people that no, you're making yourself miserable, you're giving yourself ulcers, you're making yourself lonely because you're throwing away friends and family, you're making yourself look ridiculous, you're making yourself not feel good about yourself. And until we convince people that there's a better way, that you can disagree and think that everything that Trump is doing is wrong, and still not want to attack him as a person, or attack his family, or attack, Vance's children, right? I mean, hundreds of people in the middle of Vermont show up to attack his children on a ski slope, and that's normalized. What are these people doing to themselves and their friends and their families and their neighbors? Because they're not hurting Vance. Vance is not the sort of person that's going to care one way or the other. He, it's sad. And you can look at the people who were firm believers in Japanese nationalism in the 30s and 40s, or committed Nazis in the 30s and 40s, and how miserable they were, and how difficult they made their families' lives in the following decades. And that's really what millions of Americans are doing to themselves, and doing to their families and children. And that's what we need to address. And I don't see anybody really talking about that, because nobody has any idea what to do. I don't. I haven't the slightest idea how to address that.
Well, I have an idea, but I do want to definitely congratulate you on identifying something that is overlooked, because I think my tendency is to actually look at the, I guess, institutional or systemic forces that are driving it. So when you said that people are weaponizing things, the first thing that I think is that things like hate speech, right, that hurting people's emotions has basically come to the point of being labeled hate speech, because you are engaged in emotional harm. And when I look at that, I see that coming from the rise of the therapeutic state, right? A bunch of mental health practitioners who are convinced that you need to be sensitive and careful about how you speak, because you might harm somebody if you say something that they don't like or that they're sensitive to. And I also see behind that the laws that have been passed in Europe that have migrated to the United States through the social media companies, because the social media companies have effectively incorporated the GDPR rules and other rules against hate speech into their moderation of content in the United States.
Are there GDPR rules against hate speech? I don't think
I'm
there
not
are.
sure if it's GDPR, but I do know that that the Europeans, especially in Germany, have very strict rules against hate speech. This is me interrupting in post with a clarification on this point. Since 2016, the European Commission has maintained a code of conduct for social media companies operating in Europe for the purposes of countering hate speech online, in which they have recently officially added to their Digital Services Act in January of this year. These social media companies have chosen to incorporate this code of conduct into their terms of service and practices of content moderation for content generated in the United States, even though the US has no requirement and the United States has the First Amendment specifically forbidding government infringement of speech. However, as nominally private companies, the social media platforms are allowed to exercise editorial control over information distributed through their platforms. And due to the infamous Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, they cannot be held responsible for either these content moderation decisions or the veracity and integrity of the material that they do choose to permit. I think the reason I got this confused with the GDPR is that both the Code of Conduct and the GDPR were established in 2016, likely as part of a comprehensive program by the leaders of the EU to regulate what information can be shared online. And they don't ascribe to the citizenry the rights that we have to say things, even when they are insensitive, even when they are outrageous, even when they're completely evil, right? I mean, in the United States, we have very limited limitations on free speech. And even things like yelling fire in a theater, which is classically used to describe this limit, is not really the case, because it should still be on the onus of the individual after hearing that to see whether there's actually a fire, right? And so the idea that you can harm someone through speech has propagated, I believe, from the increasing number of healthcare practitioners that seem to be using this as an opportunity to, I limit the way that we speak. And I also think that there's a partisan slant to what is and is not offensive within this regime. And also the Europeans that are essentially creating prohibitions on speech in the United States by the back door through their regulations of the social media companies. And so that's the way I think. I think about the kind of institutions or the systems that are driving the behavior that you describe. But I do really want to go back to what you said, which is that people should realize that it's not the Europeans, it's not the therapists that are causing their issues. It's actually themselves, right? And I'm not trying to blame the victim at all in this. That's not what I'm suggesting.
No, I wouldn't hold you or me up as models of mental health, right?
But I do think that you're right that people are not realizing that a lot of this hyper-politicization is actually affecting them. They might think at the time that they are outraged, that the problems are other people, that action needs to be taken to rectify this wrong. That's the trap of self-righteousness. But in reality, self-righteousness a lot of the times sort of hides a certain degree of sadness,
Insecurity.
I guess, insecurity. And it doesn't help to not have the capacity for forgiveness, which is what you meant by leniency, right? To not assume that somebody else is doing things for malevolent purposes, but that they're actually acting out of good faith and maybe ignorance or maybe some other reason. And I think that I've had to take a step back in my own dealings with the people in my life to be able to think about how I can recognize that maybe they don't see the things that I do, and that the best way for me to address a particular issue is to wait for them to be curious and then help them to understand the things the way that I do. And in that way, they might not ultimately agree with me. In fact, I don't think they ever will necessarily agree with me, but at least it will tame the sense of anxiety, the sense of immediacy, right? It allows us to have a conversation that's constructive rather than adversarial. And so maybe, like as I said, I think you're right about this, that there's individual reasons to take a step back. And if there is something going on with the destruction of mental health, a lot of the times people haven't asked, maybe the mental health, the therapists actually are making it worse, right? And
Uh,
because they're giving people the license to use words like weaponize. That's a very strong word, and it really is inappropriate to use that word in reference to things like speech. And yet, as you said, we see this frequently. So, uh, are there any things that have happened in the last week that touch upon something that you would like to discuss?
um, it's sad that some of the worst examples that have come out in the last few weeks of abuse of government money, I would say much of what the USAID has been doing is in the same category, where money that's meant to be, helping the poorest of the poor people who can't afford to feed their children in very difficult situations all over the world, and we're spending money on kabuki theater in Kenya, and transgender advocacy in the Netherlands. Uh, I made those two examples up, obviously, but it's, you know money that's meant to subsidize steel production or semiconductor production doesn't worry me so much, because the steel manufacturers and the big semiconductor manufacturers can take care of themselves. But it seems to be that we've incentivized people to exploit the taxpayer at the expense of the people who are most deserving of our care and our compassion.
This reminds me of what you said in the past about the tremendous amount of asylum fraud and how that really impacts the people who are genuinely in need of asylum.
Yeah, I mean, somebody who literally has just experienced a difficult, life-changing situation involving human rights abuses anywhere, comes to the United States and they have to wait a year to get a hearing, right? I mean, that's very stressful for them. But people who are coming for economic reasons to find a loophole in the system and exploit the system, they don't mind waiting a year because they're working off the books anyway.
And because of the degree to which this fraudulent behavior occurred, the backlash that basically cut off all applicants for asylum seems to have induced is the tragedy, right? That the people that actually need it are, as a result of this, I guess, improper decision with regard to immigration and refugee status and protected person status, or whatever the term was that the prior administration used, that
Mhm.
the result of that is that the actual asylumees, the refugees that are in most need of it, are likely not even going to be able to receive it at this point because the
I find that hard to believe. I find it hard to
okay.
believe that anybody who needs asylum, and needs to get it from the United States, is going to be disincentivized from coming because of publicity, and the fact that they're going to, that for the next few weeks or months, it's going to be harder to get an appointment. Really doesn't matter that much, because it can take years to be adjudicated anyway. The system is so dysfunctional that that shutting it down for 2 months, I don't think would really hurt anybody who really needs help.
No, what I'm referring to is the abuse of the parole system. So, what I believe that Trump reinstituted was the Remain in Mexico policy, which says that if you show up at the border and you claim asylum or refugee status, that while the United States adjudicates the your claim, that you are to remain in Mexico. And the reason for the reimposition of this is in some part it is due to the fact that prior to Trump's assumption of the office, because I believe that he signed this rule on the inaugural day, right, when he was right after he was sworn in. But prior to this, there was just rampant disregard for consideration of the legitimacy of people's claims. And so all you needed to do was give a name and an address, and they didn't even check to see if that address was actually valid, because I think that we're now discovering that something like 100 addresses were used on up to 100,000 or 10,000 different forms, right? So people were basically being instructed using social media and a variety of nonprofits that were facilitating this activity. They were being instructed on how to go through the process of claiming asylum, at which point in time they would be released on parole, which is the benefit that a person who is genuinely seeking asylum gets that has been withdrawn, because of the fact that there was such abusive use of the asylum process, and that this abuse was deliberately facilitated by the administration by the paroling of the individuals. So effectively, it meant while your case is being heard, you can just do whatever you want. And as you said, economic immigrants basically realized as a result of that they could start working. And in fact, I think in some cases, the parole comes with the opportunity to work. So in a
Right.
sense, it incentivized people to make illegitimate claims about asylum so that they could get parole.
Being granted parole uh, took so long for people who were already in the United States. I mean, the reason that you had people going from shelter to shelter in New York City was because they were eligible for shelter because they weren't supposed to be working. Now, a lot of times, we both know that's not the case from actually observing it in the city. But for people who are actually looking for asylum, I find it difficult to believe that the Remain in Mexico policy was to their disadvantage. I mean, they have to wait in Mexico and then get an appointment at the border, but then they're allowed in and granted immediate parole if they had a reasonable sounding case. They're not. They're now, the situation now 4 years later is that if you're fleeing a warlord in Central Africa and you make it to Mexico, you have to pay you have to pay tens of thousands of dollars for a coyote to get you across the border to make your appointment, or you can get a cell phone and um, install the app that used to be the case uh, to sort of replace the Remain in Mexico policy. I don't think those were good situations for somebody in that situation. Whereas, Mexico isn't that unpleasant a place to wait.
But what I'm suggesting is that for the people for whom asylum is very legitimate, and if the customary practice is to parole people who are requesting asylum, and that number is consistent over the years as it was before 2021. If you see that, the United States admits something like 20,000 people as asylees, and that in the process of their case being adjudicated, which could take 6 months, it could take a year, but like it happens within a reasonable amount of time. And during that time, you're allowed to be in the United States and you're allowed to have other privileges while you're waiting for that. When the United States policy is to actually encourage people who are fleeing persecution and oppression and very nefarious regimes elsewhere to come to the United States, and that's a part of our laws. That it's actually a part of the established immigration policies that we have. That when that changes because you suddenly and what I'm suggesting here is it wasn't just some people in Venezuela that cleverly figured out that they could take advantage of this, that there's actually a whole set of nonprofits and social media devices and advocates on social media that were facilitating this. They were saying to them, this is what you need to do to qualify to get into the United States. Nobody along the way ever asked the question, is this legitimate or not? Is this case actually going to pass or not? Because if they asked that question, what they would have realized is that for the most part, most of these people would have been considered fraudulent claims for asylum. And because of that, because of this practice having been so out of line with the level of refugee immigration into the United States, it created a backlash that now I would venture to say that half the population is perfectly content with letting nobody into the United States unless they have permission.
Sadly, I think that's true. Yeah.
And that's going to hurt the people for whom a asylum claim is actually. And this is where I was trying to come back to when you were talking about people who are addicted to drugs. Those are the people that need the help of other people because they can't help themselves. That's what addiction is. Mm-hmm. If somebody is displaced from their home and has suffered death at the hands of violence from a authoritarian regime, and they need a place that they can live productive lives and bring the rest of their family with them, then if the United States wants to be a participant in a refugee relocation, resettlement, which I believe that it does, right? And if it wants to recognize the UN's charter that grants people the right to claim asylum, which I believe that most Americans believe in, then we don't want that to be abused. And what happened, what everyone saw, is exactly how the legal system, the nonprofit system, and social media could kind of, when properly orchestrated, when properly coordinated, could effectively result in millions of people entering the United States in a way that was, if it wasn't tacitly accepted, it may have actually been actively encouraged by the members of the executive branch, right? Like that we're talking about like taking advantage of a system that was never designed to let millions of people in. And the result of that is a huge backlash that's ultimately going to hurt the people for whom actually need it. And so,
I agree. I don't think American public opinion is so anti-immigrant that we would say that our treaty obligations are too onerous. I mean, they're just not. Virtually nobody that we grant asylum to would be covered by that. Everybody is coming from third-party states that are that are safe for them. I think people forget that one of the advantages to the United States about taking in honest, legitimate refugees and asylum seekers is that they're so incredibly productive when they get here, right? If somebody is the victim of a human rights abuse, it means that some dictatorial person, some totalitarian state or criminal organization is threatened by them, and those are exactly the sort of people that are productive in free societies, and especially in America. One of the reasons that you could have, I think, some evidence that the system is broken is that the people who come in as asylum seekers in the last 4 years haven't been that economically productive. They haven't started that many businesses. They haven't filed that many patents, right? Whereas historically, some of the most important advances in science and especially weapons development that we've seen were from asylum seekers from the Nazis and communists and other groups. And I would hope that as people become more trustful of the immigration system and more trustful of the government's intentions, that public sentiment would turn around, and we'd go out and actively find people who are being oppressed and invite them into the United States, as we historically have done since World War II.
Well, I would say that even though the majority of the population at this point in time is opposed to illegal immigration, that the support for legal immigration for people who have applied for a visa and come into the United States is still high. The Americans see themselves as a nation of immigrants, and that there's still there is at the time a substantial number of people who are either first or second generation immigrants in the United States. And so I don't think that I think you're right that the United States has an interest in immigration. What I would also add to what you had said, and I thought maybe you were going in this direction, but it sounded like you were going to focus more on the economic benefits. I was very intrigued by the possibility that the United States actually wants the people who are fleeing oppressive regimes, because it's likely that those people actually did something that was honest. And what we know
Yes.
of corrupt systems is that they tend to target selectively those people who are honest. And of course, if the people who are running the federal government wish to induce into the society a group of compliant mules that will do the labor for them, then by all means just let everybody come in the door fraudulently, right? But if you actually want to inculcate and encourage within the U.S. society people who are going to stand up against corruption, or who are willing to stick their neck out when something isn't right, then I think that actually these asylum seekers are very likely to be the kinds of people who said something that was contrary to the wishes of the powerful in their country. And
Right.
and those are the kinds of citizens we want, right? I mean, if we actually want a country to continue to be run by and for and of the people.
A lot of the pushback against Biden's administration's immigration policies was that so many of the so-called asylum seekers from Venezuela were just members of violent gangs. And totalitarian regimes punish honest people, but they also incentivize dishonesty and incentivize criminal behavior. And so I mean, if you want compliant drones who are going to be the sort of people that bureaucrats like, I'm not quite sure how members of criminal gangs fit into that template. I mean, you could make an argument for or against, but clearly somebody who's coming to Venezuela to be the member of a criminal gang is not a legitimate asylum seeker. He's not fleeing the government. He's just looking for new business opportunities.
I don't think that that's the kind of business we want to encourage anywhere, let alone in the United States.
Can't be choosers, I guess.
That's true. So, because I follow the president, the White House, and I see what every day what the executive orders are. I think they post them online on their website the day after they actually announce them and Trump signs them. One of the ones that I saw recently, just this morning, was that the Department of Ed has revised its criteria for public service loan forgiveness, and the title that they use. Let me look this up for a moment. Okay, they use the term restoring public service loan forgiveness. And I was intrigued by this because I was like, is this the result of some judicial decision that they had to like reverse the policies that they had before? Because it sounds like they had gotten rid of public service loan forgiveness, and then some judge, because I know that there's a lot of court cases. So I was like intrigued. What do they mean by this?
I thought it was the other way. I thought it was the other way around that the Biden administration had expanded it past the statutory bounds, and that there were court cases involving that.
And that's exactly what this executive action is about. I'm glad that you brought that up, because what they did was they clarified that public service loan forgiveness is going there, that Trump is directing the Department of Ed to look at what individuals, based off of the roles that they are involved in and the organizations that they are employed by, would qualify as public servants. And in that capacity, they mention a number of things that they specifically say are not going to count as public service. So like they talk about, it is, you are not engaged in public service if you are doing street takeovers. Like they literally mention street takeovers.
It's funny. We actually need to make a rule about that. That's not so obvious to everybody that we need a rule for
No,
that.
what's funny is that that was considered public service for the purposes of loan forgiveness, right? So
Right.
organizing protests apparently was previously a legitimate way to have your loans forgiven, right? The another qualification that they made that does not qualify as a public servant, therefore public service, forgiveness, is providing aid to migrants in and we know, I mean, it's funny that we're talking about the situation with asylum fraud. We know that a large portion of this asylum fraud was facilitated so that there could be public funds distributed to the very numerous nonprofits that were engaged in advocacy, housing, legal aid, all of the things that where people with educated degrees. So this is sort of like a works program for college degrees that aren't worth anything in the private market, right? So, I think that what the administration figured out was that student loan forgiveness was being applied to people who were working for these migrant aid nonprofits, and they're clarifying that this is not a public servant. And then of course there's also the issues that the president is, the various different executive orders that have been applied to clarifying the government's position with regard to discrimination. And I think that what this particular executive order does is it clarifies that for the activities that prior executive orders have identified as being discriminatory in their nature, that anyone engaged in that type of activity is also not a public servant, because obviously if it's not what the government is permitting, to do that would be not being a public servant, right? So
Right.
so that got me thinking, I don't know how much money is in public service loan forgiveness, but I do know that that student debt takes up the majority of the Department of Ed's budget. And I believe the Department of Ed's budget is almost a quarter of $1 trillion.
Sounds about right.
And so when you include student loan forgiveness, public service loan forgiveness, I'm not sure what the numbers are, but that's a very large amount of expenditures that the government is doing to, I guess, not necessarily reward, but to subsidize people who pursue certain careers that may or may not be consistent with the law.
Well, they're subsidizing debt and then giving preferential treatment to people who follow certain careers, right? I mean, the real subsidy is encouraging people to get themselves into debt.
Yeah, and it creates a dilemma when this is something that affects 18-year-olds that aren't really known for making smart decisions about anything, to put them in a situation where they are shouldered with a tremendous amount of debt, because most colleges now are very expensive, right? And that debt goes towards a degree that they are may be told is useful to them, but then they find out later after they've taken on that debt that it is not useful to them in the sense of a positive investment, right? And this debt can't be forgiven except through public service loan forgiveness or the various different mechanisms that the Biden administration tried to do to forgive debt. I think that is, as you said, a dangerous thing to be doing for the government to do. It's counterproductive and misguided because it's going to cause negative social outcomes.
The major negative social outcome is, of course, people getting into too much debt from their student loans. But also, a lot of people, went to law school, for example, or went to get their MSW, thinking they would be eligible for these programs, and they weren't because they were so narrowly written. It's
Mm.
it's there's no it's the fact that we're spending a $250 billion subsidizing student loans is just insane. We've gotten to a point where we're spending all this money theoretically subsidizing higher education, and we're doing nothing of the sort. We're subsidizing a huge administrative burden on colleges and people, and not doing very much to make college affordable or to make higher education more widely available. Um, and I think that the Biden administration was wrong to do what they did because it was unlawful, and it was also um, you know politicizing the whole process. But the underlying problem is that you're encouraging people at a very young age to commit themselves to taking on huge amounts of debt that they have no idea what the consequences are.
I want to actually be a little bit more assertive, and you sort of introduced the idea that some of the debt forgiveness was unlawful, and I think that a lot of that was actually blocked by the courts. So I'm not sure that how much of that forgiveness went through or was able to be conducted anyway. But I also wanted to just mention that I think that there's something else, and it's not just the public service loan forgiveness that we're talking about here. It's, as you said, it's the subsidization of education through this loan program. The fact that the students take on this debt, which they may not understand, and is going to have deleterious effects on family formation and job opportunities and all these other potentially negative consequences. That is a problem. But I think what I want to highlight here is the fact that I think this is all avoiding the real issue of why this is happening. That this is a mechanism by which a specific party distributes goodies to the supporters of that party, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
when we're talking about public service loan forgiveness, the category of people that qualify for that, the vast majority of people that qualify for that are in a specific profession. And not
Right.
only the vast majority, but close to 95% of the people in that profession have a very specific party that they vote for. And so
Uh,
this looks just like a patronage system to me,
it, it,
right?
it, it looks like it, but I really I, I find it difficult to ascribe bad motives to any of the decision makers here. Both parties of Congress, passed the laws that became the student loan forgiveness program because it was in the public. They thought it was in the public benefit to attract uh, people to public service. And the Biden administration came in and saw this really awful situation, and tried to stretch the law to fix the problem. They were incentivized to help their buddies on the left side of the spectrum because that was the incentive structure. And maybe they did it. I think they did it in a particularly dishonest and contemptuous way. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they started with the intention of cheating the taxpayers out of billions of dollars in the same sense that I think the EPA really did in the last 18 months with the with shenanigans that we've seen come to light in the last few
Oh
years.
yeah, I agree with you. This might be a case of a system that spiraled out of control. There's a very legitimate reason for trying to do something about the debt that young Americans have, and my own conversations with others have focused on the idea that potentially sort of establishing low interest rates could be helpful, right? That if the government wants to solve this problem of debt, forgiving it is one thing, but that sends that's a very big moral hazard, especially when it is selectively distributed.
It's a moral hazard because they're forgiving debt, but they're keeping the dirty system going, right?
Correct.
If they had spent the same amount of money forgiving, say, 25% of all debt, and then eliminating the subsidies for student loans and converting all that money into Pell Grants, right? If they had done that, we would have been in exactly the same situation with the amount of money that we spent, but we would have had reform. But I think we want to keep in mind here what the outcome of these decades of bad decision making are. The cost of sending your child to college as a percentage of your average household income now is greater than it was in 1970 before we started subsidizing higher education to a large degree. The amount of money spent in terms of percentages on administration in colleges has grown by at least 40, maybe 50 times. A majority of the money spent on overhead for grants and for tuition dollars and fees is not spent on teaching or libraries or research. It's spent on administration now, and administrators on average make a lot more money than the people who actually teach the classes or do the research. That's entirely the result of bad federal policy. The universities didn't do this to themselves, right? But by forgiving some student loan debt in what was probably an unlawful way and keeping the system in place, things just got worse because we had 4 years more of inactivity.
I do believe that you're right that what we're seeing is a sort of system that has gone off the rails, that had purposes that were legitimate initially. But what I am suggesting is that what appears to have evolved from a system that had poor incentive structures is a system that looks a lot like a patronage system. And that, is it actually possible that not solving the problem is advantageous if it is a patronage system? Because you don't want to eliminate the dependency that is tying that patronage system together.
If the Department of Education were so well run that it could be a conspiracy to keep the patronage system in place, I think that would be a victory.
If student loan forgiveness is a platform item that encourages a specific demographic of Americans to vote, and you solve that problem, you no longer give, and you solve the problem of student debt, right? If you get rid of that constituency, the very large number of college educated people that are young that have a lot of debt, right? If you solve that problem, you no longer have that on your platform, right? You no longer have that as a potential bone to throw to people. And so if you are seeing a haphazard, potentially what seems to be pretty much unlawful mechanism that benefits a few people and doesn't seem to address the underlying concern, then that problem persists and that program can continue. And I mean, maybe, as I said, I'm suggesting that there is a strategy here. And I know that that is problematic because it's not falsifiable. And I know that it's unfair because we should assume good faith. But I do believe that political parties are constantly looking to build coalitions to win elections, and that they look at demographics and they look at populations and they look at ways to turn out voters in specific demographics that they know are going to vote in their direction. I mean, a lot of the polling data, a lot of the survey data, a lot of the work that is done behind the scenes that the public is not aware of, but the party members, the leaders are aware of, that the actual DNC or the RNC are looking at, is how can we get this group of people to go out and vote? Because it turns out that voter turnout is very predictive of outcome. And what your goal is to get turnout in the areas that you are confident are going to vote for you. And this particular topic this particular issue has a very significant impact on a very specific demographic. So that's why I say that I would be willing to say that there could be some strategy here in leaving the problem unsolved. And it's unfortunate.
Well, if that were the worst, if that were the worst criticism that you could find about the DNC, I think we'd all be a lot happier than we are now.
That's all I had for this week. So what do you think about wrapping things up?
I think this is a great natural stopping point.
Okay. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed the discussion, then like this video and subscribe to the channel. If you have any inconvenient questions yourself, then please leave a comment in the comment sections below. See you again next week.